A man who owned nothing became the economic ruler of the known world in 7 years, and Genesis chapter 41 encoded his exact wealth strategy in plain sight, hidden only from those too distracted to look. What you are about to hear is not a motivational story. It is a financial blueprint that predates every stock market, every banking system, every MBA curriculum ever written. And it works. Stay until the very end, because the final revelation in this script will reframe everything you thought you knew about your own season. Joseph did not stumble into power. He was engineered for it, sold for 20 pieces of silver by his own brothers, as recorded in Genesis chapter 37, verse 28. Then there passed by Midianites merchantmen, and they drew and lifted up Joseph out of the pit, and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph into Egypt. And yet within a single decade, that same man controlled the grain supply of an entire civilization. The question that should keep you awake tonight is not whether this happened. The question is why nobody teaches you what he actually did to get there. The alarm goes off. Before you sit up, you already feel it. A low hum of financial unease that you cannot name. The market shifted overnight. An unexpected expense appeared. You worked hard last month, and somehow there is still less left than you planned. That feeling is not weakness. It is a signal. And Joseph learned to read signals that an entire empire was ignoring. Here is what most people miss about the story of Joseph. Everyone focuses on the coat of many colors, the pit, the prison, trauma tourism. They rehearse the suffering and skip entirely over the 7-year intelligence operation Joseph ran from inside Pharaoh's palace. That operation is where the actual wealth strategy lives. Pharaoh dreamed twice. 2 dreams, same message. 7 fat cows devoured by 7 gaunt cows, 7 full heads of grain swallowed by 7 withered ones. Genesis chapter 41, verses 1 through 7. Most of Pharaoh's advisors saw a nightmare. Joseph saw an economic forecast. He saw what wise financial stewards have always understood. The seasons of provision and the seasons of contraction are not random. They are cyclical, predictable, and preparation during the abundant cycle is not optional. It is the entire assignment. Stop and ask yourself honestly, during your last season of increase, what did you actually store? This is the wound that most people carry without ever examining it. When resources flow, the natural human response is to expand consumption to match income. Bigger expenses, more comfort, an upgraded lifestyle that quietly becomes a fixed cost. And when the lean season arrives, and it always arrives, there is nothing in the storehouse. The cycle that should have created legacy instead created a reset. The book of Proverbs, chapter 21, verse 20, speaks with surgical precision into this trap. There is treasure to be desired and oil in the dwelling of the wise, but a foolish man spendeth it up. The wise person sees the treasure and protects it. The unwise person sees the treasure and spends it before the month ends. Joseph did something radical in his first year of abundance. He did not enjoy the excess. He taxed it. Genesis chapter 41, verse 34 instructs, "Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land, and take up the 5th part of the land of Egypt in the 7 plenteous years." 20%, not 10, not 5. 20% of all the harvest in every abundant year was extracted and stored before anyone touched it. This was not a religious act. This was a financial protocol, a systematic prevention of the wealth destruction that always follows unchecked consumption. Here is the principle embedded in that number. 20% is not a suggestion. It is the architectural margin between survival and sovereignty. Nations that stored 20% of their surplus during abundance controlled the world economy during the famine. Nations that spent everything simply came to Egypt with their hands open. Do you understand what this means for your life? Every paycheck, every client payment, every moment of financial increase you experience is a season of grain. The question is whether you are building a storehouse or building a lifestyle. And here is where the revelation becomes personal, almost uncomfortable. The reason most financial teaching fails is because it targets your habits without ever diagnosing your vision. Joseph did not save because he was disciplined. Joseph saved because he could see what was coming. He had a revelation of the cycle, and that revelation made sacrifice feel like intelligence rather than deprivation. When you understand the divine pattern of seasons written in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 1, "To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under the heaven," you stop grieving the lean season and start preparing for it during the fat one. This is the first wealth strategy nobody teaches you. Not how to earn more, how to read the season you are actually in right now. Right now, before we go deeper into how Joseph executed this at a national scale, tell us in the comments where you are watching this from. Knowing that people all over the world are gathering around this ancient wisdom at the same time is something extraordinary, and we want to celebrate that together. Joseph was not promoted because he was talented. Talent is common. Egypt was full of talented administrators. Joseph was promoted because he was trusted. And trust, in the economy of God, is a form of capital that no crisis can devalue. Consider the architecture of what Benjamin Graham, one of the most disciplined financial minds of the modern era, called the margin of safety. In The Intelligent Investor, Graham argued that the intelligent buyer never purchases an asset at its full perceived value. You always leave a buffer. You always build in protection against the scenario where your calculations are wrong, where the market moves against you, where the unexpected arrives. Joseph built a grain reserve that was so vast, so deliberately excessive, that Genesis chapter 41, verse 49 records it in almost disbelieving terms. "And Joseph gathered corn as the sand of the sea, very much until he left numbering, for it was without number." He stopped counting, not because he was careless, but because the reserves had crossed the threshold from adequate to sovereign. That is the margin of safety applied to national survival. But ask yourself, how did Joseph earn the authority to execute a strategy of that magnitude? He had to earn it inch by inch. First in Potiphar's house, where Genesis chapter 39, verse 6 tells us Potiphar left all that he had in Joseph's hand. Not some of it, all of it. Then in prison, where the warden assigned Joseph oversight of every other prisoner, not because of Joseph's resume, because of Joseph's consistency when nothing was being rewarded. This is the principle of competence preceding platform. Joseph did not demonstrate integrity when the stakes were high. He demonstrated it when no one was watching, when the reward was zero, when the only audience was God. Here is the lesson that the modern world distorts. Ambition without integrity is just noise. Every level of authority Joseph received was a direct function of the faithfulness he had shown at the previous level. Pharaoh did not give Joseph power. Pharaoh recognized in Joseph something that had been forged quietly over years of invisible faithfulness. And in Genesis chapter 41, verse 38, Pharaoh asks his court a question that still echoes. Can we find such a one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? That was not flattery. That was an economic assessment. Pharaoh was looking for a man he could trust with the treasury of a civilization, and Joseph was the only candidate. Now here is where the principle of economic cycles exposes a truth that most people find uncomfortable. Crises do not destroy wealth, they redistribute it. The famine did not make Egypt poorer overall, it transferred the wealth of surrounding nations into Egypt's hands. Genesis chapter 47, verse 14, records that Joseph gathered all the money from Egypt and Canaan in exchange for grain. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the corn which they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. Every nation that had failed to store during the abundant years now transferred its capital, its livestock, and eventually its land to the nation that had prepared. This is not cynical. This is law, the law of seasons, the law of readiness. If you want to receive what others are forced to release during a crisis, you must have built your storehouse before the crisis began. The famine was not a punishment for Egypt's neighbors. It was a test, and the only ones who passed were the ones who had taken seriously the warning they had received. God gives warnings. He always has. The question is whether we treat his economic revelations as urgent intelligence or as spiritual decoration. If this wisdom is landing with weight right now, if you feel the urgency of it building inside you, take a moment and acknowledge that by pressing like. These ancient patterns deserve to be heard by as many people as possible, and your small action makes that possible. Abundance is the most dangerous season you will ever survive, not because it destroys you directly, but because it trains your appetite to grow faster than your wisdom. Picture the person who receives a major financial increase, a promotion, a contract, a windfall. The first instinct is expansion, a better apartment, a newer car, a lifestyle upgrade that feels earned, and it may well be earned. That is not the issue. The issue is that by the time the lean season arrives, the new lifestyle has become the floor. The margin has been consumed, and what was a blessing has become a cage. This is not a modern problem. This is the oldest financial trap in human history. Joseph refused it. During the 7 years of abundance, he did not build a personal empire. He built a national reserve. He extracted 20% of all grain systematically, consistently, without exception, and he stored it in the cities near the fields. Genesis chapter 41, verse 48 tells us he stored food in every city, plural, distributed, geographically spread. This was not one storehouse. This was a diversified reserve system designed to survive regional failures. If one city burned, the others held. This is the architecture of resilience. Charlie Munger, a man who studied the collapse of systems with the cold precision of an engineer, taught a mental model he called inversion. Instead of asking, "How do I create abundance?" he taught asking, "What would guarantee destruction, and how do I eliminate that?" Joseph inverted the famine problem before the famine existed. He did not ask how to survive starvation. He asked what conditions would guarantee that starvation could not reach Egypt, and then he built those conditions systematically during the years when it was still possible to build them. Stop. Think about your own financial life through this lens. What single behavior, if left unchecked, would guarantee your financial collapse in the next 10 years? Name it, because that is the behavior Joseph eliminated first. He eliminated unchecked consumption. He eliminated the assumption that the current season was permanent. He eliminated the illusion that tomorrow would always look like today. The book of Proverbs, chapter 6, verses 6 through 8, carries this same inversion logic wrapped in the simplest possible metaphor. Go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways, and be wise, which having no guide, overseer, or ruler, provideth her meat in the summer, and gathereth her food in the harvest. The ant does not have a financial advisor. It does not need a market report. It reads the season it is in and responds accordingly. It stores when storing is possible, not because it fears the winter, but because it understands the winter is coming. And here is what gets missed in most readings of Joseph's strategy. The storehouses were not just physical, they were spiritual. Ecclesiastes chapter 11 verse 2 speaks a word that investors and prophets alike have underlined for centuries. Give a portion to 7 and also to 8, for thou knowest not what evil shall be upon the earth. Diversify, not because you lack faith, but because wisdom acknowledges the uncertainty of earthly systems. Joseph distributed the grain reserves across multiple cities, multiple stewards, multiple systems of accountability. He was not building a monument to himself. He was building infrastructure that could outlast any single point of failure. This is the spiritual and financial principle of diversification lived out at national scale. Spread the reserve, protect the supply, ensure that no single catastrophe can reach everything at once. Ecclesiastes chapter 11 verse 4 adds a corrective to the paralysis that sometimes comes with risk awareness. He that observeth the wind shall not sow, and he that regardeth the clouds shall not reap. You cannot wait for perfect conditions. Joseph did not wait. He stored during the abundance while it was happening, not after it had passed. When the famine came, Joseph held something more powerful than a position. He held liquidity. The surrounding nations had consumed everything during the years of plenty. Their treasuries were structured for maintenance, not for crisis. Egypt alone had capital, stored grain that had been systematically protected for 7 years. And that liquidity, that single advantage of having resources when no one else did, became the mechanism through which the wealth of an entire region transferred into one set of hands. This is not strategy. This is law. The person who holds resources during a collective crisis does not have to compete. They simply open the storehouse and let the world come to them. Genesis chapter 41 verse 57 says it plainly, "And all countries came into Egypt to Joseph for to buy corn, because that the famine was so sore in all lands." Every nation, not some, all. Joseph did not pursue customers. He prepared, and the customers became inevitable. The wealth transfer was not violent. It was patient. First came the money, Genesis chapter 47, verse 14. Then the livestock, Genesis chapter 47, verse 17. Then the land, Genesis chapter 47, verse 20. And finally, the people themselves entered into service of the crown in exchange for survival. Joseph became, in effect, the world's first global supplier, not through conquest, not through exploitation, but through the disciplined execution of a 7-year plan built on revelation and stewardship. Listen carefully. King Solomon observed this exact dynamic from the other direction, from the side of the man who had prepared. In Proverbs chapter 22, verse 29, Solomon writes, "Seest thou a man diligent in his business? He shall stand before kings, he shall not stand before mean men." Joseph's diligence, in Potiphar's house, in the prison, in Pharaoh's granary system, was the preparation that made his platform inevitable. He was not promoted into a position he was unready for. He was recognized for what he had already become in obscurity. And then Solomon, in Proverbs chapter 27, verse 18, adds the dimension of loyalty and stewardship that completed Joseph's ascension. "Whoso keepeth the fig tree shall eat the fruit thereof, and he that waiteth on his master shall be honored." Joseph kept what was entrusted to him. He did not skim from Pharaoh's treasury. He did not use his position for personal enrichment. He protected the fig tree faithfully, and when the fruit was ready, he was the one standing under it. The principle of diligent stewardship is the least glamorous and most powerful wealth principle in all of Scripture, because it does not promise immediate reward. It promises inevitable reward. The steward who tends the field when no one is watching, who protects the resource when draining it would be easier, who defers personal consumption for the sake of the mission, that steward builds something that crises cannot touch. When the famine came, everyone else lost what they had. Joseph kept what was never truly his to hoard, and in keeping it faithfully, he became the instrument through which the world was preserved. This is what it means to sell to the nations. Not manipulation, not exploitation, but the natural consequence of faithfulness meeting a season of need. When you have stored what others have spent, when you have protected what others have consumed, when your preparation outlasts the comfortable seasons and reaches into the desperate ones, the world does not merely buy from you, it depends on you. And dependability, built over years of quiet obedience, is a form of authority that no famine, no market correction, no season of reduction can revoke. There is a man who stood in 18th century England watching his congregation grow prosperous, and then watched them slowly lose their fire as their wallets filled. His name was John Wesley, and the sermon he preached in response became one of the most consequential financial frameworks in Christian history. Wesley's 3 rules, earn all you can, save all you can, give all you can, were not 3 separate instructions. They were a single integrated cycle. You earn with diligence, so you have something to protect. You protect it with discipline, so you have something to give. And you give with generosity, so the cycle completes and the blessing flows back out into the world, rather than pooling and stagnating in one place. Wesley understood, and Joseph lived, that the end point of sound financial stewardship is never personal accumulation. It is distribution. It is becoming the instrument through which God provides for others. Here is what Wesley noticed in 1789 that should arrest every serious believer reading this. The Methodists were following the first 2 rules and ignoring the third. They were earning, they were saving, but they were not giving proportionally to what they had received, and Wesley identified this as the primary reason the movement was losing its power. Stored blessing that refuses to flow eventually becomes a weight, not a wing. Joseph's story ends not with Joseph's personal net worth, but with his family restored, his brothers forgiven, his father reunited with his son, and an entire civilization preserved through one man's faithfulness. Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, delivers the verse that ties the entire narrative together. But as for you, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive. The slave auction, the false accusation, the forgotten years in prison, none of it was wasted. All of it was preparation. All of it was the curriculum for the position he was always being built to fill. Your lean seasons are not punishments. They are classrooms. Your obscure seasons of faithfulness are not detours. They are the precise path through which God builds the kind of character that can be trusted with the kind of authority that changes the world. Here is the 7-year blueprint spoken plainly. Identify your current season honestly. If you are in abundance, store 20% before you spend the rest. Diversify your reserves across multiple streams. Build competence in the place where you are before expecting the platform you want. Refuse to overconsume when you have plenty. Hold liquidity as a strategy, not an accident. And give generously, consistently, as the natural completion of a cycle that was never meant to end with you. This channel exists because these patterns deserve to be spoken where people can actually hear them. If this is the kind of wisdom that you want to carry forward, the ancient kind, the kind that has outlasted every empire, every financial system, every economic theory built on human cleverness alone, then stay close. There is more. And the deeper you go into these patterns, the more clearly you will see that they were always personal, always specific, always for a time exactly like this one. You were not stumbling when you found this video. May the God who dreamed through Pharaoh and spoke through Joseph speak with equal clarity into your season. May your storehouses be built before the famine comes, and may the liquidity you carry in your lean years become the provision that restores your family, preserves your legacy, and proves to a watching world that ancient wisdom still compounds.